down now.
Okay. Let me know how many.
And I would like John to stand up.
Yes.
This guy, without John, I could not do my art. And John is going to talk about mold making. I do sculpture and I do assembly work, but I could not do what I do without John. So he came to talk about how he takes my sculpture, makes the slip cast mold, and then I'm going to come back and show slip casting and assembly. Okay. I didn't think y'all would be that interested in figurative sculpture, but if you know me, that is my passion. And figurative, I started out as an occupational therapist. That's why I always have something going on. And as an occupational therapist, the frame of reference of the profession is that man influences the state of his health through the use of his hands. And so I've always used ceramics and clay as a therapeutic modality. But I've also loved the human body. And when I was a therapist, I could actually work with people whose body was not working. And I would go, I would work with people who had 100% disability that would never get better. I got tired of that. I started working with kids who had sensory integrative problems. They got tired of me. And then I went on to do hand surgery with hand surgeons. And when I did hand surgery, when I worked with hand surgery patients, my knowledge of anatomy was that I would shrink myself down as small as my imagination would take me. I'd jump inside that wound and I'd look at all of the structures that were around that injury. And by using that kind of imagination, I'd know which muscles were in the area, which ones need tendon gliding, which ones need protection, and I'd make my treatment plan accordingly. What I find fascinating, well, I love my profession. I would have never stopped had it not been for cancer, which was not my friend, and I couldn't go back into the clinic. But because I loved the human body and because I was suffering with an extreme pain syndrome, I decided that I'd go back to man influences the state of his health by the use of his hands. And I started sculpting. And when I sculpted, the pain went away. So I kept sculpting. And then I didn't care if the pain was there or not. I loved sculpting. And I got involved with, I don't know, Linda, if anybody knows Linda and David Elder. He was the teacher for figurative, he ran the foundry at Northridge, and she was a figurative instructor. And they got me interested in the process that we're going to share with you tonight. Linda would sculpt and David would make the molds. So that was the way that I was trained. And of course my little wheels started rolling and I ran across a man who not only does similar work, but makes the molds. And so I said, of course, why don't you move in? And he was graduating from college. I moved him into my house. And we had such an adventure in doing this exploration that is where we're going tonight. Now, when I do figurative sculpture, instead of jumping into the middle of the body, let's see. These are the porcelain pieces that we make, all slip cast. I do the sculpture, and then we pour the molds. And this is, I start with the red clay, and then we have to make a plastic. And from the plastic, we make the mold. And from the mold, we can assemble the finished product. Now, unfortunately tonight, getting organized for this, I didn't bring this vase or this vase, but we brought the molds. It's best this one not travel because this one breaks, these little edges. But this was sculpted from a life model. And so in my front room, we had a model on her belly, and I look at a model from 365 degrees, and I work on a 20-minute session on each 90-degree angle. And I rotate around the model with a 5-minute break in a 3-hour session. The reason I'm telling you this is you have the opportunity to do it with me. But this is a model, and I would take pictures from all 4 sides. And then I would build some kind of armature that would replicate that would, you know, be a little smaller than my end product. There's a lot of math that goes into that, you know what I'm doing it. And it is bending wire to make the internal structure. And then I add on to that wire going around. I'd stay on this side for 20 minutes. I'd go to this side for 20 minutes. I'd go to this side for 20 minutes and this side for 20 minutes. And then I'd go for a walk outside. If all I do, I'll give you a nicer shot than that one. All I do from each side, once I have my little armature there, is I try and build the envelope around the subject. If I was doing a sculpture of a head, I would build this profile first. I always start on profiles for facial features because you can triangulate them easier. I'll talk about triangulation later. And then, again, I rotate around for that 20-minute cycle. And this is what I end up with. The red clay, which is oil-based clay, and it lasts forever. You can see that they're all dusty because they just live out there. I have to sculpt. I sculpt once a week, whether I want to or not. If I don't sculpt, I draw. If I don't draw, I paint. All 3 of those are the same skills. So drawing, sculpting, and painting go together. And I realized if I have to recreate myself, I have to do it each day. And so for about the last, how long has it been? As long as you, when did you graduate college?
2015.
What?
15.
Okay, so since then I've been drawing, painting, or sculpting every day. Because sculpture is really expensive. And it cost me $25 to have a model there, an hour. $75 a session, and to rent a space this big, it's $50. So I can't sculpt every day. As a hand therapist, I usually don't finish the hands on my work unless we're going to mold it. But my passion comes from making myself as small as I can get. And I used to ride motocross. So I take motocross up and over those hips and up that side and down over the breasts. And I am totally fascinated with the physical sensation of building that form. You're used to hand building where you take big parts together. We use little notes of clay and you roll it on. And so this is what I do. My new location is at Fit Buddha. And I'm there on Thursday afternoons, and we got a 3-hour session, and anybody is welcome to talk to me about that. I provide the materials, and these are just examples of the work that I start with. So if I liked any of these, to put on a vase, I would cut it. And my joy is the figure work, and then I take off my joy and I put on my thinking cap, call in John and say, okay, John, how are we gonna make this mold?
And then begins a lot of work to transform your sculpture into something that can be fired and added. slip cast. Okay, here we go. Cool. Yeah, so this is just a plaster cast of one of her pieces. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So,
Talk a little louder.
yes, I'm John Truer. I met Shelley, I think 2011 at the California Sculpture Symposium.
California Sculpture Symposium.
And I moved to Ventura in 2013. So she was the first real friend I had here that I already knew, and I contacted her and we started hanging out. And my first semester in college, I had never done slip casting before, so I started learning it. And once she found that out, okay, let's work together. So she works in Chavant clay, which is oil-based clay, and specifically it's a non-sulfur clay, which helps out when you are making a mold with silicone, because silicone won't cure correctly if there's sulfur contacting it, which, like, if you were to use hand-building clay and try to make a mold with silicone on it, it won't cure properly and you can't do it. So that's a huge benefit of the Chavant clay. Also, it lasts forever. But what we end up with is an original sculpture that we first make a silicone mold of, which is fairly easy. There's some considerations to be had when we do this, such as undercuts and air pockets, and also just some pieces are very complex. Like this piece, for example, if there are a lot of undercuts and intricate parts, I end up cutting it into pieces and making more than one mold because it's just too complicated. If it's a 4 or 5 piece mold, then I'm willing to do that, but it's not worth the extra effort to do 6, 7, 8 piece molds. So with this piece, I actually cut the head and arms off and did 2 separate molds. One that included just the body, and the other that had the head and arms. So here's, the body mold. And it's an interesting process because all we want to do is create a slip cast copy of your Chavant original so that we can attach it to a base. And I love doing this. I'm a 3-dimensional thinker. I studied ceramics in college, so it was kind of a natural fit for me to take it one step further and help Shelley do original sculptures in slip casting. I love that she brought this dog because this kind of shows my process when creating the hydrocal molds that we use for slip casting. You have to approach it thinking of when the mold releases from the sculpture, it can't get caught on the other pieces. So that's what these lines indicate, the ears are gonna form undercuts, plaster is stiff, so there's no flexibility like with the silicone. I can make a 1-piece silicone mold of this and that's fine and pull the dog's head out, but when it comes to using plaster, you really have to think ahead, and that's all my brain does when doing this. So
It seems like the silicone's easier. Why
Silicone
don't you
is-
make everything in silicone?
Because you can't.
you can't
make
slip cast in
plaster.
silicone.
You can't make a
Typically-
slip cast
Oh,
mold.
never
You cannot-
tried.
I'm gonna get into slip casting. There's a whole chemical process with the slip cast that you cannot accomplish with the silicone because it's not porous. It's not clay. We are starting something where we will be able to make a silicone mold and make a cast product, but it is not going to be ceramic. I'm going to start doing metal casting, but it's all
Casting.
resin.
Yeah.
So the silicone molds are for resin products and plastic products. The ceramic molds, the slip cast molds, will give me ceramic products.
Thank you.
So that's a good point to bring up because as a mold maker and using different materials, I quickly realized that slip cast molds are like divided against the rest of the mold making world, because with silicone it's so easy and flexible and even reusable. You can mix it with new silicone and it'll bond. But with plaster, which absorbs the moisture out of slip, in order for slip casting to work, it's stiff. There's no way around it. So you have to make certain accommodations in order for it to work. That's what makes it so tough. This process it's complicated. It's tricky.
This kind of art was really popular back in the 1950s. Then industry developed plastics, and artists said, why am I gonna work so hard for little tchotchkes that sit on the shelf? So this kind of artwork was no longer done, and all of the sculptures are going to silicone and polymer cast. Most of the sculpture you see out there is either the polymer, concrete, what's the stuff you spackle the walls with? Plaster of Paris.
Plaster.
Yeah, and they patina them, and they look like ceramic. They're not ceramic.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, are you using pottery plaster or #1 plaster or?
It's hydrocal. So
Oh, it's hydrocal?
It's hydrocal, yeah.
That mold?
We
What
we
about
use
the
hydrocal.
5-piece one on the table?
This, I don't remember when it was made. We've varied, but most of the molds have been made with hydrocal. We've used #1 pottery plaster. I think hydrocal works the best.
It's the strongest.
It's strong,
Yeah, but
it's
it doesn't
durable.
absorb as much, but it-
Right.
you know.
It's
And
not
that's why we went to the pottery plaster.
it's not super expensive, but it's just in trying different products, I like hydrocal the best. It's gypsum.
Well,
It's
it's
plaster.
money.
It's the same thing. It's just a different mix. I think different kind of density, maybe. Yeah, we used some ultra cal before, which was super dense, and I did not like it. It did
And
not act
heavy.
right.
What kind of cal?
Ultra cal.
Ultra
Yes.
cal is like an extra
Heavy and dense.
dense version of hydrocal, but we use hydrocal, white plaster.
Can I ask why you need the interim plastic positive?
Well, that's mainly so that we can keep the original sculpture
Okay.
intact and not
Alright.
mess with it in making plaster molds, because sometimes that will
Yes.
they'll get stuck and it will
Yeah.
break your original piece. So
Okay.
that's the main reason.
Yeah, we brought all the pieces.
Plus, it's like if you're making a plaster mold directly off your original sculpture and it doesn't work, you have to start all over again.
Right.
With the silicone mold, you can just cast another plastic casting to do.
So you're preserving the master,
We're
basically.
preserving the master, and yes, also it's, I can take this and cut it or mark on it or be rough with it. The Chavant is soft. I would prefer, if money was no issue, I would actually do this secondary casting in silicone, because it's
Okay.
flexible and the plaster wouldn't catch on it. But then it's, if you know that your resin is going to release from the plaster nice and easy, then you know that the ceramic, the slip cast will as well. And it's a different world too, because the slip will shrink a little as it dries enough to release from the mold, so that can kind of present some problems with releasing. But as long as you keep that in mind, it's doable.
So that first copy is plaster or plastic?
It's resin, which is a kind of
it's resin.
plastic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, Chavant to resin to ceramic.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Any other questions?
How much do you charge to cast something?
I just work for Shelley. I don't want any side work. That's a hard question to answer too. Like, just cast something. Anybody can cast
Yeah, it's
something if
making
you have
the
a mold.
No, I meant for you to make a mold.
Oh,
How much does it cost to do it?
No,
it
to
depends
hire
on the
him.
mold.
Oh, to hire
It
him.
depends on the mold. My
Yeah,
time
and it
and the
depends on how long
material.
it takes him to make it.
Are you gonna are you talking slip casting? Because silicone stuff is easy, casting resin. But slip casting, I don't know. I think at one point Shelley did some research to find someone else that could do it for her, because I'm busy with my own life and have less time to devote to her, and she
If
couldn't
I
find
wanted
anybody
to
else
ship
that does it.
plaster to Palm Beach, Florida, I found someone.
So that's a very difficult question to answer because it depends on the mold. I mean, we're talking, a 2-piece mold is really easy. A 4 or 5-piece mold takes a lot of work, a lot of time. And sometimes I don't, sometimes I don't get it right. Sometimes I have to redo a piece or half a mold because it was a little off and it got stuck and it broke. So it's, you know, I'm still learning.
On that dog, when you cast it, the ears are so thin, how did you get the slip to go in, or did you put clay in first? Cause there's no little holes for to pull that slip past the point of the ear. And I'm
It's
curious
called
how you got those ears to fill
chemistry.
in.
The
the
casting slip,
chemistry.
it's fairly thin, and if you will imagine, that was another thing to point out here. The sprues where we pour the slip into usually end up being the bottom of the piece. Like this head here was detached from the original mold. I added a sprue, and then the mold is upside down.
Right.
So, and that's the same with this dog head, is that you pour from that, so gravity just pulls the slip to the bottom.
Gravity
It's thin,
pulls
but
it,
it
and then
works.
chemistry pulls the water out of it, so you can.
No, I understand completely, it's just sometimes when you pour, it traps air in a narrow area like those ears, and I noticed you didn't have a little pinhole that would
And some-
alleviate that air
Well, I don't think a
problem.
pinhole on the bottom would make a difference. It has worked, it's just thick enough, and I think I might have even thickened it up a little for the mold.
Okay.
Because
Well, good job.
He uses pinholes to get air through. See, this one, he needed pinholes to get the feet because it wasn't entirely, it was going up. And you can't pour in here and have the slip flow upwards. It has to flow downwards.
yeah,
And
that's,
so, up here he put 2 holes, 2 little pipes, and the air comes out of there.
well, that's a
Just
good
like what you're
point.
talking about on the
Okay,
tips of the
okay,
ears.
yeah.
What you're
Alright,
talking
thank
about
you.
with the ear is a good point too, because what we're working with in a mold is negative space. So your positive is this ear, your negative is just a little, channel that if it was too thin and we were trapping air, let's say, I could shave that channel away and thicken up what's gonna come out as positive.
No, I like the air hole, that was good.
Well, the air holes do come in handy when, for instance, part of the mold on the inside actually raises up above where the clay goes in.
Yeah, right.
You see,
Otherwise
it's
it'll
gonna
pour
trap
out.
air on the. We usually don't have a problem with air holes at the bottom of the inside of the mold. If that helps.
Have them up at the
Some
lip.
some places are really thin, but that's usually just a problem of it wants to rip when you pull it out of the mold, but not a problem with trapping air. As long as it's, facing down. Yeah, and in considering a several part mold, I always look for the undercuts, so I always approach it from, okay, there's these ears that are concave, the mold piece that goes against those is gonna come straight out.
Yeah.
You know, if you try to do it from the side, it's an undercut, it's gonna get stuck and it won't work. So, yeah, so I literally did the face like that in order for this just to slip nice and easy in and out. No undercuts. And that was the first piece I designed, that was the toughest part of this mold to make. So I draw lines and then I build clay up around the rest of it to pour plaster against that to make the most difficult piece I always start with first. And another thing I've learned to do, and doing it dozens of times, is I don't separate the mold from the sculpture until all of the pieces are finished, because I found when you do that, trying to put it back together, you always have a gap, and then you'll have bigger seams that you have to clean up later, which is just more work, and no, you don't want that. So that's how I approach this, and this would be an undercut too if you were to try to pull a piece, you know, from the side. So that's the back, the side, the front, the other side, and then we pour from the top.
What do you use as a separation salt, do you use soap or detergent or?
We use the Murphy's oil soap. It seems to work the best. I've tried other things and it seems to work the best. It's easy to find.
Where do you
So.
put that?
Well, plaster will stick to itself. It won't bond like silicone will. It can break away, but it will basically stick to itself and ruin your mold. So you have to put a barrier between pieces of plaster. So, like in making your first piece of the mold, say this first piece, then I remove the clay and block it off to make the next piece, and I'm pouring plaster against the sculpture and the first piece. And if you don't put a barrier between the plaster pieces, they'll stick together. And you can get them apart, but it will break all jagged and you know good. You know, you want a nice tight seal. And that brings up another good point. When dealing with silicone or other materials, certain materials stick together. You have to have a barrier. You can't pour silicone into a silicone mold without a barrier meant for that. And I've done experiments over the years to see what sticks and what doesn't. Silicone comes right off of plaster, so you can pour silicone into a plaster mold and have a silicone cast. Resin sticks to plaster, so I don't know if you can find a good barrier for that, but certain things will just inhibit cures. So there's different ways you can do it to get this intermediary cast, the resin cast, but this is how we do it. It's the most cost effective and fairly simple to do once you have the mold made.
What do you use to fuse the pieces after they're removed from the mold?
To fuse the separate ceramic pieces, the clay pieces,
I'm gonna show that.
she'll get into that
I got all my secrets.
with this assembling. But it's, you know, it's clay. If you were doing it, you can make a press mold and moisten the clay and attach it as you normally would in hand building. Slip cast is different with the deflocculant present in it. It doesn't hold up if you try to reconstitute it with moisture. It turns to jelly if you overdo it, which I've discovered because I've done my own pieces that I have to do it all in one shot. I cast all the pieces and I put them all together. There's no waiting and trying to re-moisten it because they will just start to jellify.
Do you ever do wax?
Wax?
You can do wax in these,
Yeah.
and you can do wax in that.
I actually did some wax casting using my plaster molds for a bronze piece when I was in Channel Islands. And
Because you can take it from a plaster mold to wax on the inside, take that wax and do lost cast.
yeah, you can do wax into a plaster mold, but you have to saturate the mold with water first. Otherwise, it will stick
Oh, yeah.
a residue on the plaster. But that's the secret. You can do
I
it.
was just thinking this for the wax, not so much the plaster.
Yeah, you can totally do it in silicone. Yeah, you can do a lot of material into silicone.
Are you a potter?
Yes. Ceramics was my focus
Your
in
major?
college. Yeah, studio art. So I've done sculpture, I've done pottery. I got into slip casting and assembling in my state university years, and just really I did it because I'm not the sculptor that Shelley is. I'll be honest, I won't finish the detail. I'll lose interest like way before I could do a realistic sculpture. I know I can do it, but I'm just like, no, I want to be done and make another one or move on. So slip casting I started because it was a way to kind of jumpstart me in figurative sculpture. I molded a Barbie doll and made all these pieces, and it was a lot of fun, and I didn't feel like, oh, I gotta spend 20 hours on this. I'd spend 6 hours on it.
So what kind of
clay do you use for the slip?
Well, let me get to, let's go.
She'll get into that.
on to this.
Does anybody have any questions about the mold making part? Cause it's tricky to wrap your mind around, but that's what we do. That's what I do.
That's great.
And of course, I'll answer any questions you have later, but yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Oh, John, you're not done.
You want to stay up each other?
Yeah, you can say yours.
Okay.
So, John did mold fabrication and now we're doing slip casting. And John used to pour. I have a studio that's open on Wednesday and Friday from 9 in the mornings until 4 in the afternoon. And I have women who love to porcelain paint. And they come over and make their blanks and then take them to another class in the neighborhood and learn to paint it. So that's part of where I sell most of my stuff is to porcelain painters. What we're going to talk about now is how you pour. And because I'm an OT, I'm going to talk about body mechanics. These are the most important tools you have for pouring a mold, which is the air hose to clean it out, a wooden tool because it won't wreck the mold lines, and you have to put water to get the chemical reaction started. So we squirt the inside of the molds when we're cleaning them before we pour, so the water will prime the pump. And if you know the difference between commercial slip cast material and clay, there's a deflocculant in it. It's not water. It's a deflocculant that is a crystal. It's usually a salt crystal. And if you use water on the mold first, it'll start pulling moisture through the mold. It will clean out all that crystal that was left there the last time you slip cast. And it'll push it out so that you get the crystals on the outside of the mold. And that's where that fuzzy comes from when you do a number of slip casting pieces. Now, these are my small molds. John does my big molds, and I'm working on a merman now. And we used to have one that was hands, real big stuff that I can't touch. So because John doesn't pour for me anymore, when I do the molds, I put them up. Body mechanics is you always work at waist level. And you work with your arms close to your body. This is the strongest part that we have. And the core strength in your body is what will keep putting pressure on your spine. And so I have a number of ways that I get around it. It's always a puzzle every time I'm out there. But we assemble it, and then we have to put these belts on them. And I never undo a belt because John's the only one that knows how to put the belts back together. And he's not there all the time anymore. So these belts stay together and they go to 90 degrees, and then you push them down with as much force as you have to hold that mold together. And this is just demonstrating that you can still work at your waist. And I just slip it over and put one belt on one direction, slip it to the other side of the table and put the belt on. This is, we work out of 5-gallon containers, so I have to be able to pick this up because John left me. And I use this big, Sissy, why don't you stay up here?
I'm not leaving you, Shelley.
He's big. I'm out there with this whisk, and we've got a, this is a sieve, it's a commercial sieve. You can buy all of these component parts when it breaks down. I've had this
Where,
for 15 years, Laguna.
by fresh disintegrate, where do you get it?
They have brush packs that you can buy from Laguna.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Aardvark didn't
no, Laguna does. And because I can't lift up the big bucket, I use little buckets to decrease the load, and then I only pour as much as I can pick up. Whoops. And notice bent knees, flat back. And I pour and let things sit between 12 and 15 minutes. Don't tell anybody, but I seldom get it right. You have to judge your timing according to the atmosphere. It's not a given. If you've poured a lot, you have to leave it in longer. If they're dry, if it's dry outside, you do less. And this is, once you pour them, you let them set, and then you pick them up, and I can't figure out any way around this. You pick it up and pour it back into the bucket. And you have to let it stay there for the amount of time it needs that all the wash on the inside goes out and it stops pouring. It's just dripping. And you have to be slow in the way that you pour it, so that when, John would know about this, when you're in the pouring position, it doesn't glug, 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 because it'll pull away from the sides, and you'll have an indented ball.
Yeah, we had pieces ruined from a small opening. We usually do that, pour too fast, and it, there's no air to go in to help it come out, and yeah, we ruined the bowling ball cast.
So since John moved out, I've been doing Pilates twice a week, and I belly dance, and I do the pouring for the class. Amazing. And so this is, when you pop a mold, this is the way you handle wet porcelain, because wet porcelain is not pugged clay. It is, okay, if you get a bag of clay, it's pugged. It means it's got a big machine that's squished all the air out of it, and it's pushed all of those clay molecules one on top of another. And you know how you wake up a bag of pugged clay? You drop it to get things to start slipping. So with porcelain, when you pour it in, I use Glacial White from Laguna. And it's a commercial glaze, so I never add water to the bucket. I'll go between two buckets and moisten it, because if I add water, I'm diluting my slip. I'm not making it better. If I was gonna add anything into it, I'd have to add a deflocculant, okay? So commercial slip is deflocculated, which means all of the molecules are going, let's get the flock out of here, And it's pushing all around through the gelatinous mass that is your slip, and all of the molecules are forming along the edge of the mold. So when you pour it out, all it's going to do is dry a little bit more, but these are molecules that are just stacked against the wall. If you put water in it, it'll turn to jelly. So all of the work that I do from here on out is done without water. And these are my slides that are out of sequence. See, now I'm pouring in and I've already poured out. But we leave it upside down overnight on an air circulating tray, so that the air will be there, and by the morning the shell is hard enough to handle. And we do this this is the dog mold, so I'm running it at the same amount of time, so that my dog mold is 12 inches thick, so is my vase mold, so that I don't have a heavy dog that'll pull the vase over. It has to be the same weight. So this is out of sequence. Here's assembly. This is an example, a different one I love dogs. And this one is a Dalmatian. One day I was bored at a show, so I put its spots on. That's not porcelain paint. So with the assembly, to get two pieces to stick together, trust me, you don't need this. You can do it with just slip. But the girls that come to my studio like it, because it has suction. And when you enhance porcelain with, this is acrylic floor polish. When you enhance porcelain, only during the green wear phase does it have an increased tensile strength. So I use that enhancer. Here's a vase when it comes out of the mold before it's trimmed, and here it is after it's trimmed. And that's not perfect, it's done. And this is the way the dog looks when I pull it out. So I have to trim this dog to fit this vase. Or I have to trim her, I have to assemble her on the vase and trim her so that she fits perfectly on the side of the vase. And it's not one time, I do it twice. So this is the enhanced slip, and all it is thickened, and it is a nice way to get that join without a seam. So there I am lining it up, and I use a brush to smooth it out, and I use my finger to get rid of the seam. You can build layers of that slip to fill in gaps. And I just keep working this seam until that's gone. And here I am, on one side, this dog's fit, and you can't see the seam. And here I am trying to fit the other dog on the other side. Any questions?
When you said, so the enhanced slip, where, that's, it's, so.
Well, you use that enhancer. What I do is I put it in a cup, I pour about 3 drops of the enhancer and it's stirred up, and it gets really thick. Then I stick it in a pastry bag and I squirt that in between the 2 parts.
So are you using your regular porcelain slip, or are you
Same
using your
product.
casting slip?
No, this is the casting slip
So the casting slip plus the enhancer is what you use to join?
to join.
Okay,
That's what I make my glue out of.
okay, great.
And it's got nice suction. Now, anytime you add something like that, or a shell onto another shell, you have to be sure to have an air bubble, so that the air will, so that it won't blow up and hit the other
Right,
piece.
right.
That was what I was gonna ask you,
What
put the
about
hole
it?
in there.
Yeah, you know, it took me a long time to figure out not to go through the vase, but to go through the sculpture. I
Do you
mean,
do it at the bottom?
yeah, let's,
Okay.
see, I would leave a hole there in the bottom. Some of the birds that I do, I make them anatomically correct. You know, it just depends, but I just have to remember to put a hole in it somewhere so it doesn't blow off. Yeah, because air will expand in the kiln and push everything away.
So you said that enhancer is floor polish?
Yeah, it's acrylic floor polish.
I mean, you go to the grocery store and you get,
That would be nice. I tried it. This bottle is $6. The acrylic floor polish is this much. And I tried them both. This one makes it thicker, this one doesn't.
but
So I've got a lot of acrylic floor polish.
so where do you get that then?
That Laguna.
Oh, so
It's meant for the slip.
Yeah.
You mean it just is kind of like a floor polish? It's
It,
really
it,
good.
it's formulated, it has the same chemical structure as the acrylic floor
Okay.
polish.
It's actually called enhancer. You
Yeah.
can just,
Por-
Make your
Porcelain
own
and
enhancer.
stoneware, high fire and low fire.
I was gonna say they make different cones of the enhancer. or-
In my studio, we only do cone 6, and we bisque to 04, and we do that. We bisque to 04 for the glaze that we use. The glaze that we use allows us to paint on it. And then this is just, I brought some pictures of my work. This is a Chihuahua. This is a Dalmatian. This is a handsome model that I decorate in different ways. He was a figurative model that I made out of clay, water-based clay, fired him, and he blew up in the kiln. But this way, if I make it out of out of red clay. They don't blow up in the kiln, and I have better success. I did this little sculpture of a skull, and I use it in a number of different things. I can't tell you how easy it was to do that skull. I did it in like an afternoon at a show or something, because every time I go into a drawing class, you have to do the tumbling skull. And when it came, after I had imagined that in my mind, drawing it over and over again, sculpting it was no problem. When we do figurative sculpture, it's really helpful in the first 20 minutes to draw all around the model and then sculpt, because you learn a pattern of shape and form where you can recreate it. And that's where I really love it. The other thing I do is I paint on porcelain, and I got, and all of my girlfriends who paint with me are 80 years old, and they don't approve of my nudes. So I quit painting flowers, and I paint nudes, and I don't hang around with the girls anymore. This is my first sculpture, and what I have fun with this sculpture is every time I make it, I can cut it differently, and I can get a different theme out of it. And then I paint it in different themes, and I have something, I do a lot of shows. I go and I do steampunk shows, because porcelain like this was very popular back in the early 1920s. And so I take, I pick out themes for my different wares. I no longer take everything, I just take figurative stuff to the appropriate shows. I take dog stuff to the appropriate shows. But because I draw, paint, and sculpt, I also do dog portraits, and I paint on leather, and I brought those cards up here. So I would like, oh, and the one thing that's nice about sculpting yourself is the more you use the mold, the less wrinkles you have. That's me, no wrinkles. And here's my plug for the California Sculpture Symposium. Look at what nice people you meet.
If you can go to this, it's a week-long symposium right near the beach in Cambria. I mean, you can see the ocean from the deck where the show takes place. And
Wonderful food.
I went 3 years in a row while I was in college. On the first year I went on a scholarship, which they offer still, I hope,
Yeah.
for the full week. And was just amazed, you know, stayed in the cabin, they feed you excellent food 3 times a day, there's a big show at the end, you can take classes. I went back the second year in exchange for video work, because I'm a filmmaker, and they were like, oh, let's do a trade. I'm like, hell yeah. I went back a third year for some more video work, so I've done 2 promotional videos for them. I can't get to it now because
You can see the
day
videos
job.
on the website.
But definitely go. If you can't make the symposium the whole week, at least go for the show on Saturday, because it's some excellent sculptures.
Every participant's invited to bring 3 of their pieces to show on the Saturday for show. So usually we've got 90 to 100 pieces in the show. Our campers, we've averaged 60 for a week. And we do stone sculpture. This year we're doing stone sculpture, fiber sculpture with Stephanie Metz for felt sculpture. Again, we've got Jason Archelaus coming from Florence, Italy, to do clay sculpture with a figurative model. From 9 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, you don't have to cook, you don't have to clean, you don't have to deal with anybody, you get to sculpt. That's why I've been involved with it for 12 years. It is a wonderful group of people and a wonderful opportunity. And I just want to thank you. It gave me a chance to go back through my process. And I'm still going, why do you do all this? But I do shows, and I really love going out and talking about my work. So I appreciate the opportunity to share with you tonight. And any questions?
To go back to your question, I would charge a couple $100 for, say, like a 3-piece mold, but I won't do it. I've done it before and it's never worth it. I help Shelly because I love her and she's been a friend for a long time, and it's one person that I trust and work with.
Well, it's really hard with working with people and it's like taking your baby and doing oral surgery on it, you know? If I didn't trust him, I wouldn't be doing this. But because the combination of our talents, I can do this.
I used to work in the ceramic department for my junior college, and as the teacher's assistant, and I was in charge of loading everyone's wear to the kilns for the finals.
And he's
So
still doing it.
There would be, and I'd have to do it all in one shot. It was, you're not leaving till you're done. Everybody's piece goes in because it's their final work, you know? And sometimes, one time, the worst, I was there for 18 hours straight. And probably loaded about 1,000 pieces. And I had an assistant who pooped out after 16 hours. I'm like, go ahead and go to sleep, I got this, even though I was falling asleep too. But I can load a kiln.
He knows how to load a
So
kiln.
her baby kiln is like,
But
it's fun.
his glaze loads look like that. That's a bisque load. But when he loads, his glaze loads are that close. It is beautiful. So, thank you so much.
Thank you.